again, powered up. Beautiful. All right. So these are just some examples, okay? You know, we saw some methods for forming a sample. We saw, again, you have to be careful because you don't want to have bias, right? You know, we don't want to have any kind of bias here. I mean, one example of bias we already saw, that was, where is it? I think we might have passed it already. Oh, these are techniques and stuff and why they're not good. So basically, remember, with a sample, you don't want to have sampling. I thought we had volunteer response bias, but although we kind of mentioned it. But anyway, these are just some ways you can actually mess up a study. You know, some of these we saw already. We mentioned sampling bias. Again, that's when the population, the sample is not representative of the population. You know, we mentioned that can happen, and that's what we don't want to happen, right? You know, we don't want that, okay? You know, that's when you have, so that's one kind of bias that we mentioned already. There's also volunteer response bias. I didn't call it volunteer response bias, but again, this is something that's bad. You know, volunteering, that again, that kind of bias occurs when the sample is all volunteers. Again, that's not, it's also a kind of bias that you don't want. Okay? And there's also called a self-interest study. Here, that's when the people running the study have an interest in the outcome. I mean, this is one example I made up where, let's say the company Gatorade released a study that verified kids who, you know, drink Gatorade have higher math scores. Okay, I'm not saying it's real, you know, something I made up. But the company here, again, they released a study they conducted that says if you drink Gatorade, your math scores in school will get better. Well, that's a self-interest study, right? Because again, Gatorade is running it, and they do have an interest in the outcome, right? You know, with this kind of study, they would sell more Gatorade and make more money. I mean, it may not be biased. It could be a true thing. It's just something you have to be careful about. You know, in other words, a study like this, you know, people have to be careful, is what we're saying. Okay. So these are just some examples. So there's different kinds of examples that we can have. And these are not the only three. Again, we saw some of these already. Another one is what they call response bias. Okay? Here, that's when the responder gives the wrong information for whatever reason. You know, they could be lying. That can happen, or they may not be lying. You know, if you gave a survey that asked people, when was the last time you saw a doctor? You know, the person may lie. You know, they may not go to the doctor, but they don't want to look bad. You know, that can happen. You know, and people also may lie because they hate going to the doctor for whatever reason. Or they may not, honestly, they may not remember. So that could be response bias. Related to this would be a perceived lack of anonymity. Anonymity. Basically, that's when the responders, they fear that giving an honest answer would negatively affect them. I mean, one example would be, like, say the company you work for, they send out a survey asking you what you think of the public relations department. Well, people might not answer truthfully. People might hate it for legitimate reasons, but they may lie because they're afraid that their boss and the company might come after them. So they fear retribution. There's also non-response bias, where people refuse to participate in the study, and that could affect the outcome. You know, this is one example where, like, you know, you have Spectrum or some other place calls and asks you to complete a survey. You know, that kind of thing. You know, people might just hang up because they don't want to deal with Spectrum. So that's another kind of bias that can occur. I mean, there is a lot of bias, as you can see, and we're not quite done yet. There's also what they call loaded questions. That's also another source of bias, you know, affecting the study. In this case, that's when the question is worded in such a way so that certain responses occur. And it could also be related to question order. I think they have seen that question order can make a difference. And that could be intentional or unintentional. They may not be trying to, have a loaded question, but it can happen. For instance, pollsters might, do something like this to meet a certain agenda. So going back to building a new school, that kind of example. We saw one bad technique that can mess up a study is, that idea of convenience sampling, right? You're going to a senior citizen center to ask them what they think of a new school being built. Okay. Well, another one would be putting out a poll that asks this kind of question: do you support the city building a new school in the area? Or would you prefer the children to attend a school in an old building that could collapse at any time? The building may not be up to code, that kind of thing. That's a loaded question, right? You can see from the wording that they're trying to get the answers, I guess, the people that would answer, they're trying to get them to answer a certain way. Okay, so again, there's a lot of different bias examples. We had some of these we've seen before, like sampling bias, right? That study could be messed up because it's not representative of the entire population for whatever reason. It's like with the school example again, choosing only seniors or choosing only humanity majors, right? That's not representative of the population. Volunteer response bias we saw, right? That's when, again, the sample is all volunteers. Self-interest study, that's when the researchers or company running the experiment or whatever have an interest in the outcome. There's response bias, that's basically giving wrong answers, inaccurate answers, that's better. A perceived lack of anonymity. There's non-response bias when they refuse to participate, and loaded questions. So there's a lot of sources of bias here. Here's some other examples. Suppose a substitute teacher wants to know how the class did on their last test, or even something else like where the regular teacher was in their in the curriculum. They might ask only the students in the front row, the 10 students sitting in the front row. Well, that's sampling bias, okay, because that's not representative of the whole class. Okay, asking only the students in the front row, sampling bias. Okay, here's another one. Let's say the Beef Council releases a study saying that consuming red meat poses little cardiovascular risk. Well, that's a self-interest study, right? Because they would have an interest in the outcome. It's kind of like with that Gatorade example I gave. Or here's another one. A school, for whatever reason, has its students fill out a survey asking them how often they consume alcohol. Well, remember, these are students, so odds are they're not at the drinking age. So there's a lack of anonymity, because again, they might be afraid if they get caught drinking while underage. So that's that kind of bias. Okay. And this is one I wanted everyone to try. So we've got some time. So I guess it'd be good if everyone tried this out for a few minutes. So let me just pause the recording. Okay. It'll take like 2 or 3 minutes.